In the closing days of World War II, as Soviet forces pushed deeper into the crumbling remnants of the Third Reich, a Red Army intelligence unit stumbled upon something in the mountains of Lower Silesia that would spark one of history's most enduring mysteries. A circular chamber buried deep within a mine complex, its walls scorched and melted in patterns that defied conventional explanation, and scattered documents referencing a project so secret that even high-ranking Nazi officials knew nothing of its existence. A weapon they called Die Glocke, the bell. What these soldiers found, or thought they found, would grow over the decades into a legend that has captivated conspiracy theorists, serious researchers, and everyone in between. A tale that weaves together real Nazi superweapon programs, Cold War propaganda, suppressed technology, and the eternal human fascination with secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. The story begins not in 1945, but years earlier, when Adolf Hitler, obsessed with what he called Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, poured Germany's dwindling resources into increasingly desperate scientific ventures. And among the thousands of projects undertaken by Nazi Germany's sprawling research apparatus, one program allegedly stood apart from all others, a project so classified that it operated under multiple codenames, sequestered in underground facilities where scientists worked under armed guard, never fully understanding what their colleagues in adjacent rooms were creating. According to the primary source of the Nazi bell legend, a Polish military journalist and author named Igor Witkowski, who first brought the story to widespread attention in his year 2000 book. The program was directed by SS General Hans Kammler, a man whose very name sends chills through anyone familiar with the architecture of the Holocaust. For Kammler was the engineer who designed the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau, a technical genius who applied his considerable intellect to the industrialization of genocide before turning his attention to the Reich's most advanced weapons programs. Witkowski claimed he was shown classified transcripts from the interrogation of former SS officer Jakob Sporenberg, who testified about the bell during his trial in Poland after the war. And according to these documents, Die Glocke was a device approximately 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high, shaped like a bell, hence its name, constructed of a hard, heavy metal that some speculated was depleted uranium. And this device supposedly contained 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a mysterious violet-colored mercury-like substance, the Nazis codenamed Serum 525. And when activated by enormous amounts of electrical power, the device would somehow generate a field that produced devastating effects on organic matter, while potentially manipulating gravity itself, or even time and space. The experiments were allegedly conducted in a secret facility near the Wenceslas mine in the Owl Mountains, today part of Poland, but then the German region of Lower Silesia. And the testing was so dangerous that the first team of 7 scientists working on the project died from exposure to whatever energies or radiation the device produced, their bodies literally decomposing from the inside, with test animals placed near the operating bell suffering crystallization of blood, decomposition of cellular structures, and the separation of blood and tissue into clearly defined layers of constituent substances, effects that sound more like science fiction than historical reality. Witkowski's account, drawn from his investigation and the alleged Sporenberg testimony, painted a picture of a crash program that consumed vast resources and operated under the personal direction of the highest levels of the SS, with Hitler himself supposedly aware of and interested in the project's progress. And as the war entered its final desperate months, as Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble and Soviet tanks rolled westward, this superweapon that might turn the tide of war became even more critical to Nazi hopes, or so the legend goes. The facility where the bell was housed was reportedly destroyed in the final days of the war. The equipment moved or demolished, the scientists either killed to preserve secrecy or evacuated to unknown destinations, and Kammler himself disappeared completely, never captured, his fate unknown to this day, leading some to speculate he fled with the technology to South America or even Antarctica, where conspiracy theories place secret Nazi bases that survived the war. The legend of the bell might have remained obscure, confined to Polish historical investigations and fringe publications, but it exploded into popular consciousness when British author Nick Cook, an aviation journalist with Jane's Defense Weekly, published a book called The Hunt for 0 Point in 2001, treating the Nazi bell story as potentially credible and connecting it to alleged American interest in anti-gravity research during the Cold War. Cook's investigation, whatever its merits, brought serious journalistic credentials to a topic previously relegated to the margins. And suddenly, the Nazi bell was everywhere, featured in documentaries on cable television, discussed on internet forums, analyzed by amateur researchers who pored over every scrap of evidence, and the story grew and mutated, incorporating new details, attracting both believers who saw it as suppressed history and skeptics who dismissed it as pure fabrication. To understand why this legend has such staying power, we need to examine the very real context of Nazi superweapon development. Because, while the bell itself remains unproven, the Third Reich absolutely did pour enormous resources into advanced weapons programs, some of which were decades ahead of anything the Allies possessed. And this is not conspiracy theory, but documented historical fact. The Nazis developed the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which could outfly any Allied aircraft when it finally saw combat in 1944. And they created the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a technological achievement that would form the foundation of both the American and Soviet space programs, after captured German scientists were divided between the victorious powers. They experimented with guided anti-ship missiles, acoustic torpedoes, infrared night vision devices, nerve agents more deadly than anything in Allied arsenals, and even prototype assault rifles that would influence firearm design for generations. So when we hear claims of even more exotic Nazi research, it doesn't seem completely implausible, because we know they were indeed working on revolutionary technologies. The question is not whether the Nazis pursued advanced weapons. They absolutely did. But whether the bell specifically existed, and whether it possessed the fantastic properties attributed to it. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated and far less certain. The primary evidence for the bell comes from Witkowski's account of documents he claims to have seen, but which have never been independently verified, and the Sporenberg interrogation transcripts, if they exist as described, have never been released to researchers or historians who could authenticate them. And this is where serious scholars begin to have significant problems with the story. Witkowski claims he was shown these documents by a Polish intelligence contact, but was not allowed to copy them, only to take notes. And in the world of historical research, this is an enormous red flag, because it makes the evidence impossible to verify. And we're essentially being asked to trust one man's recollection of documents he saw briefly decades ago. When we dig deeper into what Witkowski actually wrote, we find that his book, originally published in Polish, contains numerous inconsistencies and claims that don't hold up to scrutiny. And while Witkowski himself appears to believe what he's reporting, belief is not evidence. And without the underlying documents, we're building a very elaborate structure on an extremely shaky foundation. The problems multiply when we examine what is supposedly known about how the bell actually worked, because the descriptions are technologically incoherent, mixing together concepts from multiple fields of physics in ways that make no sense to anyone with scientific training. And while Nazi scientists were brilliant, they weren't magicians who could violate the fundamental laws of physics. The mercury plasma supposedly spinning in counter-rotating cylinders is reminiscent of real experiments with mercury in electric fields. And there were indeed German experiments with unconventional propulsion concepts. But the leap from those documented experiments to an anti-gravity device is enormous and unsupported. And the alleged effects on biological tissue, while horrific, don't match any known radiation or electromagnetic phenomenon, seeming instead like something from a pulp science fiction story of the era. When serious historians and physicists examine the technical descriptions of the bell, they generally conclude that it reads like someone with a partial understanding of advanced physics, trying to imagine what a superweapon might be like. Cobbling together real concepts like mercury vapor, electromagnetic fields, and high-voltage electricity into a configuration that sounds impressive, but wouldn't actually accomplish anything beyond possibly electrocuting the operators. Now let's examine the circumstantial evidence often cited to support the bell's existence, starting with the Wenceslas mine itself and the mysterious concrete structure nearby known as the henge, a circular ring of massive concrete pillars that some bell believers claim was the test stand for the device. And this structure does exist. You can visit it today. But there's no actual evidence connecting it to the bell or to any anti-gravity experiments. And the simpler and more likely explanation is that it was a cooling tower for a conventional industrial facility, or possibly a gas holder for the mining operations in the area. The alleged testimony of Jakob Sporenberg is cited as key evidence, but Sporenberg was indeed a real person, an SS general who was tried and executed by the Poles for war crimes. And during his interrogation, he apparently mentioned various secret weapons projects, but the specific details about the bell that Witkowski attributes to him cannot be independently confirmed, because the full transcripts, if they contain this information, have never been made public in a way that allows verification. We're in the frustrating position of hearing about evidence third-hand, filtered through Witkowski's interpretation and notes. And in historical research, this kind of sourcing is simply inadequate for making definitive claims, especially claims as extraordinary as those surrounding the bell. Then there's Hans Kammler himself, the SS general who allegedly directed the Bell program. And Kammler is a genuinely mysterious figure whose disappearance at the end of the war has never been satisfactorily explained. And he absolutely was involved in overseeing advanced weapons programs, including the V-2 rocket. So his connection to other secret projects is plausible. Kammler was last seen in May 1945 as Germany collapsed, and the circumstances of his death remain unclear, with various accounts suggesting suicide, execution by the SS to prevent his capture, or capture by the Americans, followed by quiet cooperation. And the lack of closure around Kammler's fate naturally invites speculation that he escaped with secret technology or knowledge. But speculation is all it is, and there's no credible evidence placing him in South America or anywhere else after the war. Though his body was never definitively identified, the legend of the bell intersects with another persistent myth about Nazi superscience. The idea that Germany was on the verge of developing flying saucers, and this particular aspect of Nazi mythology has an interesting origin in genuine post-war events, because in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when UFO sightings began to capture public imagination, some former German aeronautical engineers claimed they had worked on circular aircraft designs during the war, and there were indeed experimental aircraft with unconventional shapes developed by various nations during this period. The Canadian Avro car, a genuine military project from the 1950s that attempted to create a disc-shaped VTOL aircraft, shows that serious engineers were exploring these concepts. But the Avro car was a failure, barely able to fly more than a few feet off the ground and suffering from insurmountable control problems, demonstrating that building a functioning disc-shaped aircraft was far more difficult than science fiction made it appear. And if the Canadians and Americans, with all their post-war resources, couldn't make it work in the 1950s, it seems unlikely the resource-starved Germans achieved it in the 1940s. Nevertheless, the image of Nazi flying saucers became fused with the Bell legend, with some theorists proposing that the Bell itself was the propulsion system for these craft. And we end up with an elaborate mythology in which the Nazis achieved technological breakthroughs that allowed them to manipulate gravity, perhaps even access other dimensions or time travel. And at this point, we've left the realm of history entirely and entered pure fantasy. Yet these stories persist and attract believers because they offer a neat explanation for multiple mysteries at once, both Nazi superweapons and UFOs supposedly explained by one secret technology. When we step back and examine the Nazi Bell legend through the lens of Cold War history, another dimension emerges, because claims of secret Nazi superweapons served useful propaganda purposes for both sides during the Cold War, and both the Soviet Union and the United States had strong incentives to exaggerate German technological capabilities, the Soviets to justify their own massive military programs, and the Americans to rationalize recruiting former Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip, despite their war crimes. The Americans brought Werner von Braun and hundreds of other German scientists to the United States, whitewashing their Nazi pasts because their expertise in rocketry and other advanced technologies was deemed too valuable to leave for the Soviets. And if you're going to make morally questionable deals with men who built weapons using slave labor, it helps if you can argue they possessed irreplaceable knowledge of world-changing technologies. So there was a built-in incentive to hype Nazi scientific achievements even beyond their already impressive reality. The Soviets, meanwhile, captured their own share of German scientists and facilities, and they, too, had reasons to emphasize how advanced German research had been, both to justify their own technological programs and to explain why they needed to devote such enormous resources to military research. And in this environment of secrecy and propaganda, myths flourished, and it became difficult to separate genuine captured technology from exaggerated claims and outright fabrications. The psychological appeal of the Nazi Bell legend is also worth examining, because it taps into several powerful narrative archetypes that humans find compelling, starting with the idea of secret knowledge hidden from ordinary people, knowledge that, if revealed, would transform our understanding of reality. And this is the same impulse that drives belief in suppressed free energy technologies, alien contact covered up by governments, and ancient advanced civilizations whose achievements have been deliberately concealed. There's also the appealing notion that history contains hidden turning points, moments when everything could have gone differently, and the Bell provides an alternate history where Germany might have won World War II if only the device had been completed sooner, or if the scientists had fully unlocked its potential. And for some, particularly those with sympathies toward Nazi ideology, this offers a comforting counterfactual. But for most believers in the Bell, the appeal is not pro-Nazi sentiment, but rather the thrill of uncovering suppressed truth and the exciting possibility that conventional history is incomplete. The Bell legend also feeds into contemporary concerns about uncontrolled technological development and government secrecy. Because if the Nazis were developing something this advanced and dangerous in the 1940s, what might be happening in secret government facilities today? And this is where the Bell story connects to modern conspiracy theories about Area 51, black budget projects, and alleged suppression of revolutionary technologies by powerful interests who benefit from maintaining the status quo. When we examine the actual physics and engineering supposedly involved in the Bell, the problems become overwhelming for anyone with scientific literacy. Because the descriptions mix together concepts from different domains of physics in ways that suggest the originator of the story had a superficial familiarity with scientific terminology, but no deep understanding of the underlying principles. The idea of counter-rotating cylinders filled with mercury being subjected to high-voltage electricity might produce interesting electromagnetic effects, possibly even some plasma phenomena. But the leap from that to anti-gravity or time manipulation requires invoking physics that simply doesn't work the way the story suggests. And while our understanding of physics continues to evolve and deepen, the fundamental principles that would be necessary to make the bell function as described would require overturning so much established science that it becomes functionally impossible. Gravity manipulation, in particular, is extraordinarily difficult according to everything we know about physics, requiring either massive amounts of energy equivalent to that of stellar objects, or conditions of space-time curvature that cannot be generated by any terrestrial technology we can imagine. And while general relativity does describe how gravity works, and theoretically allows for things like wormholes or warp drives under extremely specific and likely impossible conditions, none of this can be achieved by spinning mercury in a bell-shaped container, no matter how much electricity you run through it. The alleged biological effects of the bell are equally problematic, because while high-intensity electromagnetic fields can indeed affect living tissue, and ionizing radiation certainly causes cellular damage, the specific effects described, particularly the crystallization and separation of blood components, don't match any known physical phenomenon and read more like something from a horror story than a medical report. And if Nazi scientists had somehow discovered an entirely new form of radiation or energy with these properties, it would represent a revolution in physics that would have had countless other implications and applications beyond weapon development. At this point, we need to address what concrete evidence actually exists versus what is speculation built on speculation. And the honest answer is that the physical evidence for the bell is essentially non-existent beyond some ambiguous structures in Poland that might be related to mining operations and could potentially be connected to secret weapons programs, but could just as easily be mundane industrial facilities. And the documentary evidence consists of claims about documents that have never been independently verified, and accounts from witnesses whose testimony cannot be corroborated. This doesn't definitively prove the bell never existed, because proving a negative is notoriously difficult. But it means that anyone presenting the bell as established historical fact is making claims far beyond what the evidence supports. And in historical scholarship, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And for the bell, we don't even have ordinary evidence that meets basic standards of verification. The responsible position, the one that respects both the historical method and the complexity of World War II history, is to acknowledge that Nazi Germany did pursue numerous advanced weapons programs, some of which were remarkably sophisticated, while also recognizing that the specific claims about Die Glocke rest on a shaky foundation of unverified sources and scientifically implausible descriptions. And we can be fascinated by the story, intrigued by the possibility, without accepting it as proven fact. The persistence of the legend, despite the lack of solid evidence, tells us something important about how myths are created and sustained in the modern age. Because we live in an era of unprecedented access to information, but also unprecedented ability to spread misinformation. And a compelling story with just enough surface plausibility can spread around the world and become embedded in popular consciousness, regardless of whether it's true. And once established, these narratives become self-reinforcing as people find what they think is supporting evidence, interpreting ambiguous data in ways that confirm the story they already believe. The Nazi bell has become a fixture in alternative history, appearing in documentaries, books, video games, and countless internet discussions. And each retelling adds new details, smooths over inconsistencies, and presents the story with greater confidence than the evidence warrants. And this is how legends grow, through repetition and elaboration, until the questionable source material is forgotten and the story takes on a life of its own, treated as established fact by people who have encountered it through secondary and tertiary sources without ever examining the original claims critically. What makes this particular legend especially persistent is that it combines verifiable historical elements like Nazi superweapon programs, real people, like Kammler and Sporenberg, and actual locations, like the Owl Mountains, weaving them together with speculation and unverified claims into a narrative that feels plausible, even though its central premise is not supported by credible evidence. And this is the hallmark of effective historical mythology, the blending of truth and fiction so thoroughly that separating them becomes difficult for anyone not deeply familiar with the source material and the relevant science. If we're honest about what we actually know versus what we wish were true or find exciting to contemplate, we must conclude that the Nazi bell, as described in popular accounts with its anti-gravity properties and revolutionary physics, almost certainly did not exist. And while it's possible that some classified Nazi project became the basis for the legend, perhaps involving mercury-based experiments or unconventional research into electromagnetic phenomena, the spectacular claims about gravity manipulation and the specific technical descriptions appear to be post-war fabrications or dramatic embellishments of something far more mundane. The real history of Nazi superweapon development is fascinating enough without needing to invent anti-gravity devices. And when we study the actual V-2 rocket program, the jet aircraft development, the advanced submarine designs, and the other verified projects, we see a picture of a regime that was indeed investing heavily in military technology, often at the expense of practical defensive measures that might have prolonged the war. And this desperation to find a war-winning superweapon, this faith that German scientific genius could produce a miracle to offset Allied numerical and industrial superiority, was itself a kind of fantasy that led Hitler to make increasingly irrational strategic decisions, diverting resources from proven weapons to experimental programs that had little chance of affecting the war's outcome. In the end, no wonder weapon saved the Third Reich, and the scientists who had worked on these programs, whatever their technical brilliance, found themselves captured by the victors and put to work serving new masters. Their knowledge of rocketry and aerodynamics proved valuable, while their more exotic research, if it existed, apparently led nowhere. The post-war world was indeed transformed by captured German technology, but in the form of rockets that would eventually send humans to the moon and jet engines that would revolutionize aviation, not anti-gravity bells that bent the laws of physics. The story of the Nazi bell, then, is not really about what happened in the final days of World War II, but about our own time, about our fascination with secret knowledge, our appetite for alternative histories, and our sometimes tenuous relationship with evidence and critical thinking. And while it makes for a compelling story, one that has entertained and intrigued millions through books and documentaries, we do ourselves no favors by presenting speculation as fact, or allowing our desire for mysteries to override our commitment to rigorous historical investigation. The real mysteries of World War II, the genuine historical questions that remain incompletely answered, the actual suffering and heroism and horror of that conflict, these deserve our attention more than legends built on unverified sources and scientific impossibilities. And when we chase after Nazi bells and Antarctic bases and escaped war criminals with superweapons, we risk trivializing the actual history, turning it into entertainment rather than engaging seriously with what actually happened and what it meant and what it continues to mean for our world today. So where does this leave us with Die Glocke, Hitler's supposed secret anti-gravity weapon that would change everything if only it were real? And the honest answer is that it leaves us with an unproven legend, a fascinating story that tells us more about the people who believe it and spread it than about what actually happened in Nazi Germany's final desperate months. And while we cannot absolutely rule out that some kernel of truth lies buried beneath the accumulated layers of speculation and embellishment, the story as commonly told does not meet the basic evidentiary standards that historians require before accepting claims as fact. And until and unless someone produces the actual documents Witkowski claims to have seen, allows them to be verified by independent researchers, and can provide a scientifically coherent explanation for how the bell could have functioned as described. The Nazi bell remains what it has always been, a Cold War myth, more revealing of our own era's obsessions than of Nazi Germany's actual capabilities. A reminder that even in our age of information, compelling stories can spread and thrive regardless of their truth, and a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking, proper sourcing, and scientific literacy when evaluating extraordinary claims about the past.